Hello everyone. It's an absolute pleasure to be back here. Let's talk about a topic I am extremely passionate about. And yes, that does happen in SEO. I'm a bit of a geek, so I do like the technical details. So let's talk about sitemaps. Yeah, you didn't think that today, right? Boring topic. No, it is actually quite cool. And I'll tell you why. Now, sitemaps, just for anyone who doesn't know, are simple files on your server that basically contain all the URLs of indexable content on your website. Now, these URLs we can find by looking at your database, or we can crawl your website to extract those URLs. A lot of people think, well, this manages my crawl budget. Unfortunately, it doesn't. However, what it does do is communicate to search engine what is our priorities. Which URLs do we want to have crawled more frequently and more often? Yeah? Which ones are important to us, in a nutshell? It also strengthens our canonical signals, which is actually quite important so we can avoid messages like these. They help us communicate a consistent preferred URL to search engines like Google. Now, I did talk last year about optimizing for search bots, so if you want to check out that talk, this is the URL. I also do, as Kelvin said, the BrightonSEO Advanced Technical SEO on-page training, so feel free to sign up for September 12th if you want to join me for that one. Coming back to sitemaps, there's a couple of different formats that we can use. One old school one that you may have heard of is the HTML sitemap. Now, I personally do not like the HTML sitemap that much, and I'll explain a little bit why. Other formats, and most used, are the XML sitemap format, which allows us to also use indexes, which is pretty cool. In addition to that, it allows us to add additional information to image sitemaps, video sitemaps, and news sitemaps. As well as, and this is actually pretty cool, and I'll show you an example why, hreflang, which is actually really, really cool. Another format that a lot of people are not aware of are actually feeds, and most CMS systems support feeds. So they have already a feed available, which means you already have a sitemap. Now, there is a downside with a feed, like RSS or Atom feeds. There is a downside, that is that it mostly contains the latest URLs and not everything. So it's not ideal. Another alternative are plain text sitemaps. Now, I do run into situations where developer teams are refusing, for whatever reason, to program an XML sitemap, but you can convince them to set up a plain text file with one URL per line, because that is basically a valid plain text sitemap. Yeah? Valid sitemap. So by all means, do that if you can't do XML. It's also quite interesting because in the industry right now, you'll see Bing as well as Google, they're working on indexing APIs. And some people say this will replace the XML sitemaps. Bing is doing a similar thing. They launched that a few months ago. So I don't think, though, that the indexing APIs will replace sitemaps. Because although we can have indexing APIs communicate which URLs we want to have crawled now, we still can't add the additional metadata like hreflang or news or video, etc. So I don't think XML sitemaps are going away anytime soon. And sincerely, I really hope they don't, because it's way too cool. Now, we do want to measure success, and what we can do is we can structure our sitemaps in a way that we can track them separately. For example, if you have an e-commerce shop, you can have all your product pages in one sitemap and all your category pages in another sitemap, and measure it that way. Add those sitemaps then to Google Search Console and see how Google is crawling those particular URLs. Get the stats, or get the errors that Google is running into. Yeah? When you then go to Google Search Console, and this is something I really like about the new Google Search Console, is the fact that you can actually filter. You can actually filter on all URLs, all the submitted URLs, which is a combination of all your sitemap URLs, or per sitemap. If you haven't checked that out yet, check it out. We can see per sitemap, or as an aggregate across all sitemaps, what the issues are, which wrong URLs are in our sitemaps. But we can also work the other way around and see what is not in our sitemap. So these are URLs that Google has identified as URLs ready to serve to users, while we have not added these to our sitemaps. As such, we may not be aware of that these particularly indexable patterns are being served to users and impacting our rankings and user signals and everything else. Now we can get that sample from Google, but unfortunately it's just a sample. So we still need to look at our log files and get all the other ones and crawl them. Now we can use the URL inspection tool to check if each individual URL is indexed or not and submitted or not. Yeah? And that is how we measure the success part. Now there are some misconceptions within the industry as well about sitemaps. For one, people say, okay, I put it in a sitemap, now that guarantees it being crawled. No, it doesn't. There's no guarantees. It's a suggestion to search engines. It's not a mandatory rule or guarantee. Same goes for rankings. Sitemaps do not impact rankings at all. Yeah? So forget that part. We don't want to use it as such. There are also limits that we have to keep in mind when we're talking about sitemaps. Sitemaps can only be that big, and we have to split them up in multiple sitemaps at that point. For news, this is actually even a slightly different limit that we're talking about. As you can see, time is actually a major factor for those limits. Any news article that is more than 2 days old should not be in your news sitemap. We can also add additional fields to XML, but I do run into a lot of resistance with the XML sitemaps, as I mentioned earlier with developer teams, because they obsess about all the fields they need to fill out. The good thing is that most search engines don't care about any of those fields except for the location. Yeah? Which means you can pretty much ignore the other 3. So that makes your job a lot easier. And a common mistake I also see is that people include all the URLs of their website, indexable and non-indexable. Now, ideally, a sitemap should only have the canonicals of the indexable URLs. Now, the only exception to that is when you're trying to de-index something and trying to track if that is happening. So in that case, you want to create a separate sitemap with just those patterns that you want to get de-indexed, separating them from your normal sitemaps that should just have the canonicals of the indexable URLs. You also need to keep your sitemap up to date. It's very often that I run into situations where you ask them, okay, when did you last update your sitemap? Well, that was 6 months ago. Seriously? A website changes in 6 months. Yeah, so you need to keep that up to date. Ideally, you do this dynamically when needed. Also, be mindful, don't nest indexes. It's a specification on the sitemaps.org website not to do that. Now, some search engines are smart enough to figure it out, but why leave things to chance? Don't nest indexes. Location matters as well. Where you put your sitemap matters. If you put your sitemap in a subfolder, then all the URLs in that subfolder, all the URLs in that sitemap should be for that subfolder. Now, the same goes when it comes to different host names. And we can get around that by using the robots.txt. Reference our sitemap in the robots.txt. And we can get around these restrictions. This is according to the official documentation of sitemaps.org. Here's an example of where it goes wrong. This is a well-known Linux website, gnu.org, where we see a robots.txt on HTTPS, and you can see that the sitemap reference is to HTTP. When we then check that, we get redirected to the HTTPS sitemap, and then we see again a reference to HTTP. Now, if we follow that too, again, we redirect to HTTPS, while all the patterns, including all the hreflang annotations, are on HTTP. So this is a faulty way of making your sitemap. Yeah? These patterns need to be updated. Now, I want to very briefly talk about internal linking. Christoph did a great job talking about internal linking already. So I just want to say one thing, and I'm coming back to my HTML sitemap issue. HTML sitemaps, if you have no other way of improving your internal linking, can be a tool in your tool set to fix some of that. However, it's by far not the best way to go about HTML sitemaps, because HTML sitemaps should not support your internal linking. Your internal linking should be your HTML sitemap. Every link you put on your website is contributing as an HTML sitemap. Think about that. Every other format, on the other hand, from sitemaps, do not replace actual internal linking. So you still need to do internal linking. Just because you have a URL in your sitemap does not guarantee it actually gets crawled or anything else. It doesn't get link juice, etc. You still need to actually place internal links. Now let's talk very briefly about a couple of situations how sitemaps actually solved other SEO issues. So here we had this website that had no canonicals and was using internally URLs with tracking IDs. In the Google search, it looked horrible. Now, this is not what we wanted. Unfortunately, the CMS was pretty not flexible, like we couldn't change marks, we couldn't add canonicals. That would have solved a lot of the problems. However, custom CMS, not always possible. Luckily, we were able to change the internal linking and remove the tracking ID and replace it with event tracking in Google Analytics. Now, with that, we also added a plain text sitemap, and as a result, we let Google crawl. Some time passed for Google to process everything, and yes, all the URLs in the sitemap, in the SERPs, basically were now without that tracking ID. So it worked, great. This is what we wanted. We were not able to add the canonical, but we were still able to change the URLs in Google SERPs. Another situation that arose where sitemaps really helped us out was improving page speed, specifically for Googlebot. So we had this website which was based here in the UK, with servers in the UK to be close to users. Unfortunately, within Google Search Console, we had horrible stats when it came to page speed. So we implemented browser caching to make sure that our responses could be cached for at least 6 hours to 12 hours. We implemented an Edge, a custom Edge server. We put this in the Google Cloud in the US. We also set up a crawler with a cron job. In this case, we use Screaming Frog with command line. So we could basically do a cron job, and on a day-to-day basis, 2 times a day, 3 times a day, we could crawl the entire sitemap, which we did. And we did this all within the US, in a Google data center in the US. We crawled and we cached, by doing so, we cached all the important pages that were in our sitemap that we considered as the important pages for the website, and we cached that locally in the US on our Edge server. As a result, our page speed significantly improved for Googlebot, yeah? While we still had our main server in the UK. So again, a solution was made using sitemaps. We were able to do this because of the sitemaps. Another way that sitemaps once solved some issues was with having multiple sites. Now this is something that I've run into, unfortunately, way too often, where we have multiple websites on multiple domains with servers in multiple countries. Now this is a challenge. We wanted to add hreflang. The problem was too many stakeholders, too many priorities. They all had different priorities. Yeah? So this was a huge organization with different IT teams in each country, with different servers, and they wouldn't let us edit their websites. We could not add the hreflang tags to their content, yeah, to their HTML. What we could do, on the other hand, was, luckily, access their database. They did have databases available, and we could extract all the canonicals from these databases, and even filter them by indexable state. We built a sitemap based on that, added the hreflang annotation, put this in a cloud bucket, like in a storage bucket in the cloud. Yeah, so on a place elsewhere than any of those servers. We added that bucket also to Google Search Console, so we could let Google Search Console know, hey, we are related to that particular bucket and those sites. And we reference every single host name's sitemap, because we generated multiple sitemaps, one for each host name. We added these to the robots.txt. So in the end, the only thing that we changed on all those domains was one line in the robots.txt. everything else we kept fully under control on our side. We let Google crawl, and yes, we did see positive results when it came to hreflang in the Google search results. So again, sitemaps really can be useful. Just a very last quick thing I would like to say as well to hopefully open your mind as how we could use sitemaps also. We can use, for example, the command line and look at, hey, how about we download all the sitemaps using command line, using this nice command, and store all the URLs. We have all the URLs in one go. We can do this ourselves. We don't need crawlers for this. We can do that ourselves. We can do it also with indexes. There's a nice article here that explains everything. Unfortunately, I would have loved to make written this article myself. I have to give credit. Do check out the article. Yeah? One of the other things that we can do, for example, with this is find mismatches. I have seen situations where here, for example, going back to that Linux website, where we have 61,000 patterns estimated. Now, keep in mind, this is just a sample, this is an indicator. This is not the fixed number like, oh, that's it. But it gives us a bit of an idea. Like, okay, how many URLs are there within the Google index on this? Just an idea. Yeah? Then we counted all the URLs in the sitemap, and we only got to 4,500. So 4,500 on one end, 61,000 on the other end. My guess is they're going to have internal SEO issues. They don't even know all the URLs they have. Now, 61,000, even if it's an indicator, is by far out of the ballpark. Yeah? So that tells us that. So again, sitemaps can be used in different ways. And I'm hoping that I opened your eyes to that for today. So just a couple of quick takeaways. There are multiple formats. Choose the one that works best for you. Yeah? Ideally, you just have the canonicals of indexable URLs in your sitemap. Keep in mind that sitemaps really strengthen your canonical signals, allows you to add additional information like hreflang, image, news, etc., video. And sitemaps can solve creatively other SEO problems. They can assist in solving those, but you need to use them. This is why I love sitemaps. So with that, I want to thank you for your attention. My name is Fili Wiese. I used to work for Google Search. Nowadays, I'm an SEO expert at Search Brothers. You can find me on Fili.com as well as searchbrothers.uk. If you want a copy of the slides, send me an email through the form on either website, and I'll send you the slides. Thank you very much.